Hello, everyone. Again, this is Professor Hasselman, and today we're going to be talking about the world in 1450. Last time we met, we talked about the Americas and Africa and where they fit into the post-classical period, and now we're going to be looking at the pre-modern era, this era beginning around 1450. Now, a number of crucial changes took place by the middle of the 15th century, many of which would set the stage for the next period in world history. Several of the developments were conditioned by the decline of the Arabs and the receding of the Mongol empires. The most familiar, undeniably important change involved the increasing explorations of Europeans down the African coast. This pattern, however, must be put into a world historical perspective. China made a number of crucial decisions in this period also, extending and then ending a fascinating series of expedition. Russia, by 1450, was casting off Mongol rule, but was also deeply affected by the death throes of the Byzantine Empire. Change in the Middle East highlighted the rise of the Ottoman Turks, a development with implications for Europe and Russia as well. Now, quite coincidentally, changes in the Americas prepared for later shifts in the global mix. Now, almost all world historians agree that around 1450 or 1500, a significant break occurred in world history. By 1450, the great era of Arab politics and merchant activity had passed, as had the Mongol era. And given the demise of these two great systems and the continued importance of interregional economic and cultural contacts, what kind of system would replace these previous frameworks? Now, specific developments in the first half of the 15th century focused on China. With the expulsion of the Mongols from China at the end of the 14th century, the Ming dynasty came to power. Like many new dynasties, it was vigorous, benefiting from an expanding economy and interested in new political statements and a degree of territorial expansion. Beginning in 1405, under the Ming, the Chinese mounted a series of huge expeditions that took troops, goods, and political and cultural representatives from the Pacific coast of China through Southeast Asia to East Asia, South Asia, West Asia, and the Indian Ocean coast of Africa. Now, these expeditions were likely mounted to extend the Chinese custom of seeking tribute from neighboring contacts, but for 30 years, these expeditions provided the most striking interregional contacts operating during the 15th century as a whole. Now, the expeditions were successful in bringing Chinese connections to Indonesia and other parts of Southeast Asia, in establishing a new Chinese presence in India, and in establishing links directly with the Middle East, particularly the Persian Gulf region, and with the states of East Africa. The expeditions were an important assertion of economic strength, building on the established position of Chinese manufacturing that had begun in the Song dynasty and had been extended under the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Now, in 1433, the expeditions were ended by imperial decision. There have been a traditionalist bureaucratic suspicion of these costly expeditions on the grounds that they overemphasize naval activities and commercial groups. A new Ming emperor wanted to establish policies that would be different from those of his predecessor. It's also possible that although the expeditions had resulted in considerable tribute, the crude economic calculation, in terms of short-run cost benefits, argued for termination. Now, the new representative of the dynasty further believed that investment monies would go to two other important projects. One project was the new Ming capital at Beijing. Another project was the reconstruction of the Great Wall of China to keep the Mongols at bay. Now, the end of the Chinese expeditions did not end China's economic role in world trade, nor did it isolate China from the rest of the world. It did, however, signal an end to the brief flurry of Chinese initiative into the rest of the world. Now, a second center of developments around 1450 involved the Middle East and Southeast Europe. The decline of Arab rule in these regions left openings for the immigration of new peoples from Central Asia, particularly the Osmanli Turks or Ottoman Turks, who began to appear around 1450. The Ottoman Turks were fervent Muslims, heavily influenced by Sufism. As they migrated into the area, they seized territories from Arab states and focused on attacking the Byzantine Empire. Now, a major player during the post-classical period, the Byzantine Empire, had been declining for some decades before 1450. Now, this decline made the empire a prime target for this new series of interlopers. The Turks laid siege to Constantinople, and in 1453, the city fell and was renamed Istanbul. This fall is one of the great events in world history. For the Middle East, the fall represented a clear step in the establishment of the Ottoman Empire, which would provide a new source of political and military power to a region that had been fragmented for almost 2 centuries. The fall of Constantinople also represented a new opportunity for the Turks and Islam to move into the Balkans and southeastern Europe. Even before the fall, the Turks had seized territories in parts of modern-day Greece. Thus, the change for southeastern Europe was in many ways just as great as the impending change for parts of the Middle East. The Byzantine Empire had been the model for Russian development, and the collapse of Constantinople represented both a terrifying challenge to the Russian state of identity and gave Russia a new sense of itself as heir to the mission of the old empire. The fall of Constantinople was a symbolic and real challenge to other parts of Europe, including Western Europe. West Europeans, particularly Italians, had treated Constantinople scornfully in the last days of the Byzantine Empire. West Europeans ignored appeals from later Byzantine emperors for assistance against the assailing Turks. But when the city fell, Europeans had to face the fact that a bastion of Christianity had been removed in favor of a new and fairly potent Islamic presence. Now, in conjunction with these developments, Russian political rulers began to fully cast off Mongol rule in the early 15th century. By 1450, a steadily expansionist Russian state was forming around Moscow, and the fall of Byzantium served as an additional spur. Now, not every place in the world changed or changed significantly in 1450. Africa experienced basic continuity, despite political shifts and changes in trading patterns, and the rise of the kingdom of Songhai was an important development in the Sudanic region. 1450 was not a striking point in Japanese development, even though some adjustment took place, and developments in India were not marked by any dramatic shifts around 1450. The more dramatic changes would come 50 or 70 years later with a new series of Islamic invasions into India. Now, we also find significant developments in the Americas. By 1450, both the Aztecs and the Incas were beginning to encounter new challenges to their rule. Quite independent of other events, then, the political structures of the late post-classical period in the Americas were beginning to unravel, and this would facilitate European entry after 1492. Now, the final series of developments occurred in new forms of European outreach. Beginning as early as the 13th century, individual merchants and rulers had shown some interest in breaking the confines of European geography and its focus on the Mediterranean as an artery of trade. Farther to the north, Scandinavians had crossed the Atlantic and reached North America, then retreated to more interesting and durable settlements in Greenland and Iceland. By the early 15th century, patterns of exploration down the African coast were extended. This exploration was sponsored by the King of Portugal, newly freed from Muslim control, and by rulers of Spain. The explorations pushed steadily down the African coast, partly in search of gold. The larger framework, however, was the recognition that Europe faced difficulties in post-classical interregional relationships. The Europeans had developed a taste for Asian goods, but not the capacity to pay for these goods by seeking new sources of gold and other opportunities. the Europeans were trying to remedy a clear problem in their interregional outreach. The Europeans also wondered if they could find a direct connection with Asia around the African coast to avoid Islamic middlemen and cultural challenges. This interest in finding solutions to the cultural and economic problems of dependence on Islamic merchants was further galvanized by the fall of Constantinople and the new potential for Muslim organizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, the conventional textbooks on West European history offer a somewhat different background to these new expeditions. By 1450, European political capacity was beginning to improve. The feudal monarchies in England, France, and increasingly Spain and Portugal had achieved a bit more central control over their territories. They also had somewhat greater capacity to guide trade policy and mount significant exploratory expeditions. European Christianity, not a new force, may have given a new lease on life in terms of missionary spirit by the expulsion of the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. Spanish, and to a lesser degree Portuguese Catholic leaders, played prominent roles in the explorations that began to take shape in the 15th century. We also need to acknowledge the new attitudes developing in the Renaissance, first in Italy, and by 1450 spreading more widely. The Renaissance brought new attention to this worldly activities and suggested new confidence in the potential of individual achievement. Nonetheless, the world history picture continues to be more complicated than a focus on just the West allows. Key problems remain in terms of world position, including the issue of Islamic intermediaries and the need to compensate for Islamic control in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, as the expeditions unfolded in 1450 and afterwards, they do reveal other points that bring us back to motivations. The expeditions failed to find massive troves of new wealth, although they did find some new territories. Europeans began to take over island groups in the southern Atlantic, such as the Azores and the Canaries. The native populations of these islands were extremely vulnerable to some of the common diseases brought by the Europeans, resulting in rapid depopulation. And this was, at once, a useful development for the Europeans. Local resistance was minimal, and a challenge because of the obvious need to find additional sources of labor. The solution adopted was to raid the northwest African mainland, where slavery was well established, for sources of labor. The Europeans began to import African slaves into these island groups with the purpose of establishing sugar cultivation. Now, the policy was perfectly understandable in terms of European interests. The Europeans had an economic problem, and growing sugar, rather than importing it from Asia, was at least a partial remedy. Nonetheless, this policy of economic exploitation did raise some interesting questions about the nature of the Europeans' role in the world as Europeans gained new level of power. Now, once the Europeans succeeded in rounding the southern tip of Africa and reaching Asia directly, they still had a balance of payments problem. When Vasco da Gama returned to India for a second time after 1500, he brought a solution to this problem in the form of guns. Da Gama deliberately slaughtered a number of Indian officials to induce the rest of the population to trade, even though the Europeans did not yet have to offer in exchange. Now, moving forward from 1450, a variety of developments occurred in a number of different places. Both the Chinese expeditions and their curtailment set the stage for European initiatives that would form a new framework for interregional trade. Developments in the Middle East and the arrival of the Turks, the fall of one of the great Christian empires, and the beginning of new assertions by Russians also need to be factored into the world picture. The end of the post-classical period saw the gradual emergence of a new system of interregional trade that would be immensely important, but it also saw power and cultural shifts in other regions. It also set the stage for a complex pattern of development in world history's next period.